Now we'll look at some of the different ways that you can set up data binding with Vue. We've seen that you can use string interpolation to cause property values in the data object to be rendered to the page. So knowing that, you might, for example, try to create a dynamic link using string interpolation inside an href value, like so. Of course, we'd need to define URL as a property of our data object, and we'll just use Google's homepage for a quick example. Before we try this out, I'm going to go ahead and enable autosave in Cloud9, since we'll be updating and refreshing a lot, and it will save some keystrokes. Let's click the gear icon in the upper right, and then under Experimental, we can turn on autosave, which, although still experimental, is pretty reliable for a single user. So now if I refresh the page in Chrome and then click the home link, I can see that it didn't try to substitute anything for that expression in curly braces. If I go back and open the Chrome Developer Tools with F12, I can see that in the console, we get a very useful warning that tells us that this syntax isn't going to work. And it gives us two alternatives, which are vbind or something called the colon shorthand. So let's see what each of those look like. In Vue 1.0, this would actually have worked, although it often made code a little messier and there were some gotchas to be aware of, such as the fact that if this were, say, an image source attribute, the browser would try to download the image before Vue even had a chance to perform the interpolation. So I'm going to comment this out and add a note here. So instead, we have the vbind directive, which can be used with an HTML attribute by placing vbind colon before the attribute name, like so. The browser will then ignore that attribute until Vue has converted it into something it recognizes. And now that Vue knows that it's responsible for this value, it doesn't need those curly braces as an additional hint. So let's try this again. So now we see that it's correctly inserting a value for that attribute. And in the developer tools, if I go back under Elements, where we see the live DOM, you can see that this looks exactly like a static anchor tag with no additional JavaScript magic required. The attribute value that you use with vbind doesn't have to be a data property name. It can be any valid JavaScript expression. For instance, if I wanted my URL to be dynamic, but always have a certain query string on the end, I could just concatenate this with, say, $myparam equals 1. Just be sure to use quotes around this literal string portion. So now you can see it's appending that query string parameter there. Now let's see what the colon shorthand looks like. I'll add a form with a single text input for name whose value will be bound to a new data property called name. So we can see that that name value appears in the field. The colon shorthand is just what we call it when we remove v-bind, leaving only the colon in front of that attribute name. Vue will treat this just like a vbind. I tend to prefer the colon shorthand, but you may want your data binding to stand out a little more when you're visually scanning files, so it's really just a matter of personal preference. Although it's not always necessary, it's a common practice to store your Vue instance in a variable. VM is a common name because it's short and it stands for Vue Model, which is more or less what the Vue instance is, although Vue Model is in that category of terms whose meanings will probably be debated forever. Binding a data property to an href value or a form field value isn't too impressive on its own, but let's see what happens if I use the console to assign a new value to vm.name. And note that just like with string interpolation or bound attributes, I don't have to access these values through vm.data. It's just vm.name. you can see that it updates the form field value right away. And we'll talk more about the mechanism by which that happens later on. But seeing the DOM update when we assign that value should start to give you a sense of the real power of data binding with Vue. Because we really only need something like Vue if we want our DOM to respond to changes in data, such as this one. In the next video, we'll look more at how the DOM can respond to data changes, and also how data can respond to changes in the DOM.